Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Association of Indian Research Scholars 51st event. I'm glad that all of you are able to join us today. Today we have with us Dr. Alfredo Toro Hardy, who is a retired Venezuelan career diplomat, scholar, ambassador, and author. Before we get into an introduction about Sir, I request my colleague Ajab Rangunwala to give a brief introduction to Association of Indian Research Scholars and the work that we have been doing since the past 2 years. Over to you, Ajab.
Thank you, Ariba, ma'am, and good evening to everyone. The Association of Indian Research Scholars, also known as AIRS, is the brainchild of the President Ariba Esnath Mosem. It was created to bring together like minded, intellectually inclined, and enthusiastic research scholars of our generation. It aims to collectively increase the knowledge base through interaction with the best minds in the world. In the past year, we have been able to have passionate discussions with Professor Mozam Ali, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Rajain Harsha, and Professor Arun Patnaik, among others. AIRS saw its first event in the month of October 2020 with the inaugural lecture, The Post-COVID World Order, by retired Professor Muhammad Mozam Ali. He was the head of Department of Political Sciences at University of Hyderabad. The aim of this association has been to provide a platform for young scholars to connect with experts where they can have stimulating and interactive sessions with them. We have not only brought on the greats on our platform, but have also managed to start the Young Scholar Lecture series with Artika Ganguly's lecture, Coolies in Indian Literature Understanding Colonial History and Modern Slavery. But I have also done our first book discussion on the book China versus the US Who Will Prevail by Professor Alfredo Hardy, who is present with us here today. The highlights of the last year's lectures were riveting topics with regard to social sciences research. We had looked on the concept of war and warfare with two lectures. The first by Nono Rodrigues on psychological warfare, theory and practical implications, and the second lecture was by Paul Szymanski on outer space warfare challenges, theory, doctrine, strategies, and tactics. This year, we are pleased to announce the start of our few new ventures that have added to AIR's online reach. AIRS has come up with its very own quarterly newsletter, AIRS Digest, that documents the various achievements of the association. There's also a fun new venture that has been taken on by Ariba and Zeba called the Banat Book Banter, which uses its platform to discuss and reflect on books that have been read. Yet another venture taken up is called Decoding Concepts with AIRS. In this platform, the team tries to take on new or challenging theoretical concepts related to humanities and social sciences and tries to explain to them all under 5 minutes. We look forward to lectures by eminent personalities, Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard and Professor Noam Chomsky of the University of Arizona and MIT this quarter, as well as more upcoming lectures by various other personalities, which will no doubt expand the repertoire of AIRS in its endeavor to create a space of thought and knowledge for research and researchers. AIRS is available on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, Telegram, as well as it has its own website, airs.org.in. Thank you. And over to you, Ariba ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ajab, for that. To introduce Sir, Alfredo Toro Hardy, sir, is a retired Venezuelan ambassador, like I mentioned previously. Before resigning from his country's foreign services, he served as ambassador to the US, UK, Spain, Brazil, Ireland, Chile, and Singapore, as well as the director of its diplomatic academy. He is a Fulbright scholar and visiting professor at Princeton and Brasilia universities. He was also an academic advisor on diplomatic studies at the University of Westminster. He's an online professor of University of Barcelona and two-time Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center resident scholar. He has authored around 35 books on international affairs. With this, I hand over the mic to.
Thank you very much. I would like to express my appreciation to Dr. Moassem and to the Association of Indian Research Scholars for this invitation. I'm very glad to share with you my new book, America's Two Cold Wars, From Hegemony to Decline, which has been just published by Pilgrim Macmillan. The book, which has the book essentially aims at answering two basic questions. First, how different as a strategic competitor was the Soviet Union to current China? And secondly, how different is the United States of today to its former self when confronting the Soviets? The first two chapters of the book are dedicated to present a general overview of the Soviet Union collapse and China's emergence, after what the books engage in 5 propositions. In precisely, I give you an answer to the first two questions that I mentioned. The first of those propositions is from ideology to efficiency. Although multifaceted, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States had ideology at its core underpinning element, something for which America was particularly well suited. Having been the birthplace of liberal democracy and its most devoted preacher, it was easy for it to reclaim the mantle of leader of the free world, particularly so after Woodrow Wilson endowed America's foreign policy with a missionary impulse in that direction. On the other side of the fence, the Soviet regime also embodied an ideology that aimed at global expansion. This ideological contest was not only clear-cut, but unmistakably favorable to the United States. Freedom, notwithstanding the contradictions that the free world notion entailed, was indeed an arrow directed to the Achilles heel of a totalitarian system as the Soviet one. This emerging Cold War between America and China is not based in ideology. To begin with, America's liberal credentials have lost its credibility as they are being seriously contested within the country itself. Moreover, all that matters for China since Deng Xiaoping time is that the cat catches mice, meaning that the system delivers. Hence, not only America's liberal order has become an ideological non-starter, but what seems to matter in this fresh rivalry is the capability shown by each to outmatch the other in terms of results. Efficiency, thus, becomes the defining element of this new Cold War. Contrary to the comparative advantage that the US enjoyed during its Cold War with the Soviets, the country is badly prepared for a competition framed in efficiency terms. Indeed, America fares poorly in numerous areas in relation to other countries of the developed world, as many of its domestic problems have been left unbridled for a long time. Conversely, during a bit more than 4 decades, China has shown the most impressive historical record in delivering. In Kevin Rudd's term, former Australian PM Kevin Rudd's term, what has happened in China during this period of time is the equivalent to the English Industrial Revolution and the Global Information Revolution combusting simultaneously and compressed not in 300 years, but in a few decades. The second proposition I made is from hegemony to the squandering of alliances. In the final phase of World War II, or subsequently, a network of multilateral organizations, initiatives, and alliances began to take shape under American auspices. Through this network, the United States positioned itself at the head of a potent hegemonic system, one in which its legitimacy was sustained by consensual acquiescence of the others. The US spectrum of allies was as diverse as was its capability to implement the system, to articulate the system on behalf of its core world objectives. On the other side, the Soviet Union gave rise to a much more modest system of alliances, initiatives, and common institutions. And although non-alignment defied both sides, with India playing a very important part within the non-alignment movement, the fact is that Washington's network remained as the epitome of political, military, and economic strength. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole community of nations had to find arrangement under this Washington umbrella, under this US hegemonic system, which henceforward became global. Incomprehensibly, under the light of common sense, George W. Bush proclaimed the futility of multilateral cooperation, which in his view just constrained the freedom of action to which the United States power was entitled. This raw unilateralism gravely weakened a system that had served Washington exceedingly well, while eroding the country's standing within it. Although the possibility for America to redeem its credentials, its credibility, was well on the way during Barack Obama's term, Trump's arrival to power frustrated all of it. His combination of unilateralism and isolationism cut short that possibility. His dog-eat-dog approach to foreign policy ended up by shattering the trust in US leadership. America's allies thus find exceedingly difficult to tie this future to a country so prone to zigzags and extremes, particularly so as in 3 years' time, Washington could be again inaugurating a fresh Trump administration. My book, Hamas Above, could not have anticipated the reinvigoration of NATO and of some American alliances resulting from Russia's invasion to Ukraine. Although I do believe that this alliance may prove out to be more circumstantial than otherwise. As in 3 years' time, as I mentioned before, the US could be inaugurating a new Trump administration. And much questions are still unanswered in relation to how this new alliances would survive to a long war in Ukraine or outside, of course, of Europe itself. Hence, my book stated before the Ukrainian invasion that the United States is entering its Cold War with China with few true allies, and after having squandered one of its biggest assets, which was its impressive network of alliances. The book, however, refers to the geopolitical bloc in the making between China and Russia, two countries that the United States should have never allowed to coalesce in the way they have. Since 2008, when Russia made clear that it would not accept further Western encroachments near its border, and China began its assertiveness towards the United States and within its own region, Washington should have approached the lesser of these two rivals trying to build in bridges. As things stand now, in the best case scenario, Russia becomes a huge distraction in relation to America's main rivalry, which is China. Whereas in the worst case scenario, these two competitors might coordinate their actions at some point. At the same time, China has undertaken a multilateral institutional building process that recalls the efforts of America in the final months or subsequent years of World War II. As in the US case, these aims had given shape to a favorable international institutional architecture, albeit one which is essentially oriented towards economy and not to political aims. This not only neutralizes to a significant extent China nationalistic excesses, but allows it to acquire a huge array of stakeholders in its future. The third proposition I would like to make, or that I made in the book, is from a strategic consistency to zigzagging. The 2 decades that succeeded the end of World War II represented the golden age of America's foreign policy. It was a highly rational period where consistency prevailed. A group of rules of the game and conceptual bases became associated with this period. At its center, there was a fundamental guiding strategy: the containment of the Soviet Union expansionist impulse. From 1965 onwards, when the Vietnam War turned America's life upside down, its foreign policy system became dramatically shaky. Not everything, though, was overwhelmed by the emerging political tumult within the US. Although it became more difficult to maintain consistency in foreign policy matters, Washington certainly retained the capability to do so. This consistency proved fundamental in confronting the Soviet Union with success. Today, America's foreign policy consistency is non-existent. In the past, America was vertically split by its multiple divides. This was coherent, this was consistent with the anti-majoritarian nature of the American system as constructed by its founding fathers. Nowadays, however, partisan identities have merged with those multiple divides, generating two overwhelming majorities, Democrats and Republicans, that coexist side by side, demonizing each other. An overwhelming horizontal fracture is touching not only the political system itself, but society as a whole. Foreign policy zigzagging becomes thus unavoidable, as Republicans and Democrats inhabiting two completely different foreign policy planets. Although the containment of China is basically the only foreign policy issue where Republicans and Democrats can converge, besides, of course, current opposition to Russia's invasion to Ukraine. A master plan on how to confront China is totally lacking. Inhabiting two foreign policy planets doesn't help much in defining such master plan. China stands in a completely different ground. Beijing has a clear national project and a well-rounded foreign policy that aims at providing support to the materialization of that national project. Even more, its geopolitical ambitions are more localized, interconnected, and in most cases close to home. This in turn is supported by its economic objectives, which include transforming China in the epicenter of an Asian-led global economic order while attaining global technological leadership. More broadly put, China marches towards its own perception of what its own destiny should be, meaning becoming the number one power by 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic. China's capability to implement its foreign policy strategy is closely linked to Xi Jinping's leadership. And although his autocratic drive has created many excesses and certainly derailed a well-established succession model, it has provided China with greater unity of the party to the party, with civilian control over the military, and with a reconnection between party and population through its nationalistic policies. Hence, contrary to the US divisions, China seems to be much more cohesive under the leadership of its core. The following proposition is from economic high ground to economic lowland. At the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union was sustaining a defense budget that comparable to that of the United States, but from a GDP base that was but a fraction of America's one. Moreover, while the United States had a highly diversified economy, the Soviet one was exceedingly dependent on its oil exports, making its defense budget contingent on an inherently volatile raw material. As if that was not enough, the United States was able to offset the Soviet Union by maintaining a technological edge. This translated into forcing the Soviets into even bigger spending to compensate for the technological gap. On top, as the two superpowers competed on a global scale, Moscow had to multiply its expenditure to provide military support in different parts of the world. The Soviet Union's quiet man multiplied upon Ronald Reagan, Reagan's arrival to office. Did not only sustain Jimmy Carter's decision to put an end to the tent, but went much further, rolling back communism all around the world, attempted to make nuclear armed missiles obsolete by developing a strategic defense initiative and pursuing regime change in Moscow itself. Countering often an offensive of this caliber would have required an economic strength that Moscow was far from possessing. Simply put, then, the Soviets were pushed to the ropes by bankrupting its economy. China is in a different category altogether. It accounts for 25% of the global industrial output and contributes with around one-third of the world's economic growth. In a few years' time, it should be surpassing America's GDP in absolute terms, while it already did so in purchasing power parity terms. After 2030, it is estimated, although the COVID crisis and the closure in China decides otherwise, it is estimated that the gap will begin accruing on China's behalf, who, by mid-century, could be attaining a GDP 3 times larger than that of the United States. Hence, China's possibility of outspending America's military budget at will be the future scenario in a few years' time. However, without reaching economic supremacy and still spending much less in defense than the United States, China has already developed the capability to maintain America's larger defense budget and superior military strength at bay. This is attained in several ways: by maintaining a technological edge in asymmetric weapons, by developing a retaliatory nuclear capacity within a minimum deterrent nuclear strategy, and susceptible of inhibiting America's first use of its vastly superior nuclear arsenal, and by concentrating the bulk of its armed forces close to home within a area denial strategy, which goes at countercurrent with America's diffusion of its military forces all around the world. The following proposition, the fifth proposition, is from reasonable containment to unattainable containment. The US emerged from World War II as the richest and most powerful nation in the world, which should have translated into a time of supreme confidence on the country's international towering presence. It was paradoxically a moment of much uncertainty, and insecurity for Americans. As they became conscious, war made them conscious of the extent of its interconnection to the rest of the world. They understood well indeed that that only by way of an international environment favorable to their values and interests, protection could be found. In that sense, their fears were directed to an aggressive Stalin, whose country had emerged from the war as a military juggernaut and which seemed ready to exploit global instability on its behalf. The US most articulated response to that fear came by way of its strategy of containment to Soviet expansions, a patient, systematic, and long-term containment process. However, as Stalin understood that no new gains were possible in Europe beyond the so-called Iron Curtain, Soviet expansionism and America's containment moved into the so-called Third World. Friction between the two superpowers were those removed from the most geopolitical combustible region of the world, Europe. This substantially reduced the risk of a direct confrontation between them, with the notable exceptions of Berlin in 1960 and Cuba in 1962. Both the Soviet Union and the United States avoided geostrategic charged scenarios. In the end, containment proved to be extraordinarily successful, attaining the goal that it has pursued since its inception. Having attained its end with the Soviets, nothing seems more natural for America than trying to replicate this containment policy in relation to China as well. And it did, even if not framing it as such. Obama, Trump, and Biden have followed the containment road in relation to China. However, they have done it without a map. They have done it without a master plan and with amid multiple ups and downs. Consistency in this case is tremendously weak. But that is not a big problem. The big problem is that geopolitical feasibility seems to be lacking. Is it viable to indefinitely constrain China to a secondary wall in an area which is of geostrategic priority to it? It seems difficult, especially so when its layer defense in depth control of the area contrasts with a huge distance from the United States. Moreover, how to contain a force whose main objective is precisely to deter penetration by force. In sum, during the First Cold War, the United States had the wind on its back, with all the right configurations of factors supporting it. The playing field was the right one, meaning the core underpinning element ideology was its biggest strength. Its support base was wide. An extensive network of alliances reinforced its position. The consistency of purpose was clear-cut. Both domestically and externally, the US followed a clear roadmap. The economic correlation between the parties clearly leaned on its behalf. It inhabited in the economic high ground. Uh, sorry. And the final objective as such was attainable. Containment was a reasonable and plausible strategy. These factors allow for a successful outcome. In this emergent Cold War with China, the opposite happens, with America confronting the wind on its face, as well as the wrong configuration of factors. The playing field does not favor it, as the core underpinning element is its main weakness, efficiency. The support base is faltering as true allies are scarce, and its credibility among them is in a very weak position. The consistency of power is also weak, as its political parties inhabit different foreign policy planets and its society is utterly polarized. And although it still exhibits a China bashing common denominator, this falls short from an articulated foreign policy. The economic correlation puts it in a flickering place, as in a few years' time, the US will be sliding into economic lowlands. And the final objective is unattainable or seems unattainable, as containing China doesn't look as a reasonable proposition. On the other hand, China can excel in an efficiency oriented context. Its international support base, given its wide array of economic stakeholders, is wide. Its focus and consistency of purpose are strong. Its economic strength will keep increasing with every passing year, and the notion of its containment doesn't seem plausible. As a result, while the first Cold War ended up projecting the United States to the pinnacle of the international system, this new Cold War can only propitiate its dwindling. The US's two Cold Wars might thus signal its transit from preeminence to decline. With such unauspicious outlook, common sense would advise that the United States explores alternatives to Cold War with China, avoiding a zero-sum confrontation, accepting the inevitable emergence of China, and looking for constructive cohabitation. These seem to be reasonable propositions under the current situation. As Paul Kennedy has clearly stated, overreach is the main reason why great powers may enter decay, and confronting China under these circumstances may lead to an American overreach, especially so if it has at the same time the main rivalry of Russia as well. Confronting both China and Russia at this point in time may represent a clear overreach of America's response capabilities. However, even if the United States would arrive to this conclusion, it is clear that you need two to tango. China might indeed be an unwilling partner, as it perceives itself to be precisely at the time of the big power to show. That is, amid great changes, amid what Xi Jinping calls great changes not seen in a century, and when time and momentum are on its side. Hence, this is a difficult situation because China may be an unwilling tango partner even if the US decides to dance tango. Thank you so much, and whatever questions you would like to make, I'm open. If there is any question on the floor, well, I presume that there is no further questions, or I presume that perhaps we have been disconnected, or that Dr. Moazem is not in line.
Oh, no, no. So we're here only. And we do have a few questions for you. Um, so starting with why does the title imply that it is America's Cold War? Usually in international relations studies, the Cold War is a stage in history that had implications for all the states. Why and how is it just America's Cold War this time around?
Well, it has always been America's Cold War. The first Cold War was a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the definition of Cold War was given before Cold War was initiated at the end of the 1940s, was given by um, Orwell, uh, who defined it as a power confrontation short of war itself, but that it's definitely not peace. Hence, it's not that the rest of the world is not in peace with itself and with the rest of nations. It's that the United States and China are in a state short of peace, but not having reached yet war. That was the situation between the Soviets and the Americans, and this is the new situation in which we are entering between those two countries. The rest of the world may be suffering the consequences, or would suffer the consequences of this Cold War, but it's not the rest of the world who is involved directly in it. It's that the rest of the world are not direct actors within this great powers rivalry era.
Thank you, sir. We have a few more. Uh, so, how similar and different are the confrontations between US and the USSR in the first Cold War and the US and China in the second Cold War, as you label them in your book?
Mm. Could you repeat the question, because it is my impression that was the nature of the lecture in itself. That was what I precisely tried to convene. So it seems that I was not very successful in doing so. So if you can repeat the question, I'll appreciate it.
Yeah, sure, sir. Um, how similar and different are the confrontations between the USA and the USSR in the First Cold War? And now the USA and the China in the Second Cold War, as you label them in your book.
Well, I must refer myself to my more than a half an hour lecture where I try to explain that.
Uh, yes, sir, but uh, what do you think that now when we've seen the USA and the China, the how the USA has been reaping out benefits from the Ukrainian situation too? So, what is your stance there, sir?
Well, the issue being that we are leaving the globalization era behind and we are entering again into a new great power competition era. This great power rivalry, it's coming back with a vengeance. And all the benefits that the world derived from the globalization era are going to be tested to its maximum. Um, with when the United States entered in its Cold War with uh, the Soviet Union, we haven't lived for a long time this kind of trade, all the benefits of of an interconnected world. Actually, the globalization era had ended with the beginning of the First World War, the old globalization period that was led by the United Kingdom had ended with the with World War One. So when the United States and the Soviet Union entering this new Cold War, the background was Second World War, was a period of great lack of interconnection in the world. So it was a completely different situation. In this case, we are leaving behind slowly but surely a globalization period in which the world was interconnected, in which the world derived high benefits from these interconnections in order to enter in this great power rivalry era, which will be directed by this confrontation or by this uh, rivalry between the United States and China mainly, but more broadly with this bloc in the making between the United States and Russia.
Thank you, sir. And I'll take the last question for tonight, for today's session. That is, given USA's continued inclination towards physical war, with first with the East Asia and then the Middle East in the last few decades, how do we read US's international politics with other countries that it doesn't go to war with?
Could you again please repeat
Yeah.
the question?
Sure, sir. Given that USA's continued inclination towards physical war, it was first with East Asia and then the Middle East in the last few decades. So now, how do we read US's international politics with other countries that it doesn't go to war with?
Well, war is not a necessity, it's a choice. And of course, it all depends on how the international situation in the Indo Pacific area is handled, not only by the United States, but by China as well. There are many unanswered questions. Would there be, by instance, an invasion of Taiwan by China, by mainland China? If such, how would the US react? There are many unanswered questions, but the fact remains that you cannot label that the only belligerent party in this equation is the United States. You need you need to tango again when referring to war, and in order to create the conditions for war, you need that the two actors involved take the choice of going to war instead of solving the difference through pacific means.
Thank you so much, sir. So, hmm, I think you, um, so. I think, sir, with this, we've ended our question answer session. And now I will take this opportunity to thank you. And I'm sure it was a great learning experience. And I agree. And when I say this, I think all people watching and who are going to watch this will agree. the the arguments that you've presented, the central theme of your book has been, and the command over the topic and the depth of knowledge that you've given us today, it's been awe-inspiring. And I thank you all for joining today and making this book discussion a success. I thank the president of AIS, Ariba Ehsanat, for her unfailing efforts in the conceptualizing of this discussion today. I would also like to thank our I would also like to thank Alfredo Toro Hardy, sir, for taking out his valuable time and gracing our platform with his presence for the second time, sir. So thank you very much, sir, for that. And I thank the team who's always behind the screen for putting up such a show. So thank you, everyone, and have a great week ahead.
Thank you so much. It was really my pleasure, and I would like to congratulate the association for its inspiring uh, and forward activities.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. We really appreciate, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.